Dr. Wideman's introduction pretty brief. He's from Southwest.
I'm coming right back.
You heard that, okay. He resides just outside of town here with his wife and children. And as many of you know, he grew up on a dairy farm, and then in 2005 he came to join this wine industry, and we are very thankful that he has. Benchmarking is something that he does a lot of work in, not just within the practice, but I know within OPIC as he's the lead vet that I work with on the antimicrobial benchmarking as well. So this is a topic that is right up his alley. He's the industry expert, and with that I'm going to turn it over to him. The only note I'm going to make is that at 2 p.m. we have another producer profile upstairs in the main room. So we're going to try to wrap this up about 1:55. So that everybody can get back up for the producer profiles. And if you see me, I'm just going to be trying to get everyone into some seats. We might actually have to get a couple more chairs. This is a good problem to have. Mm-hmm. And with that, Dr. Wideman, it's yours.
Okay. Thanks, Andrea. And we don't have a sound system down here. I'm being recorded for a video, but there's no amplification. So can you guys hear me back there okay? Okay, good. If it gets if it gets a little too quiet, just give me a signal, okay? And I'll try and speak up a little bit. Use my big boy voice. So I don't have any pictures of barns because I'm not a producer. I've got tons and tons of numbers though from looking through some of the data that producers that have made the jump to loose housing have been generating these last few years. And I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. I think there'll be some interesting stories for us to talk about there. And I see as I look around here a whole bunch of producers who are already really knowledgeable and experienced with housing sows in loose housing situations and producing pigs that way. So by all means, if something comes up that you want to comment on or contribute to or ask a question about, just go right ahead, right midstream. I don't mind that. And I always say this too, if you see a slide there that you want to get a picture of so you can remember what we were talking about when you get home, by all means, that's fine too. I think this is all going to be on the internet at some point, but you can take a picture if you wish, okay? So we're going to move kind of fast, and because I'm now the fourth speaker of the day, some of the stuff which I have in here has already been covered, so we're going to jump right over that and try and focus on new stuff for the next half hour or so. Okay? So as I said, the strengths and the weaknesses of the loose housing versus gestation sows, and we've been talking a lot about that. I have a couple little points to make in addition to what the folks this morning have already shared with us. Then we're going to look at some benchmarking that's in the literature, and we're going to try and figure out what other people have experienced when it comes to production in loose housing versus gestation stalls. And then I'm going to show you some stuff, as I said, here from our vet practice in Ontario. This chart, I got to be careful, got to stay on the screen. Can you see here, Marlon, past me? You can make do? Okay. This chart comes from the Prairie Swine Center there. It's an excellent chart describing, I think, the 5 main types of loose housing, with the low-tech options here on your left and the more high-tech options and some of the more expensive options over on the right. And I'm not going to go through this whole chart. We've been talking about this all morning. I'll let you know, though, when it comes to Ontario, and you probably know this too, I think the 2 more common systems that have been implemented the last few years are ESFs, and that often includes an option to sort the sows automatically through the ESF, or the free access ESF, which would be the feeder that the sow walks into and then backs out again, but it doesn't do any sorting. There's a few more chairs over here on this side, guys. If you want to have a seat, that's no problem. Here's some of the things which I feel like I've seen in my travels. For sure, it is nice to spend time in a loose house sow barn. Those sows are laying out, kind of exhibiting their natural behavior. It's nice to be in that environment and see those sows moving around. And so, yeah, the ability to express natural behaviors is a real strength. We've been told that sows in loose housing have stronger bones and muscles and less lameness. That I believe that, but keep in mind that a lot of the farms that we're going to be talking about for the next little while here are new farms, and some of the gilts, which are produced and selected, are just not standing on good enough feet and legs to survive in loose housing. That's been one of the things I think we've learned, is that we need to encourage our partners in the genetics industry to really work with us to continue to select and produce gilts that have strong feet and legs, because the weak ones don't make it. Less stereotypic behavior in loose pens. That hasn't come up yet this morning, but that's that chewing on bars that you can see in gestation stalls. I must say, however, that in pens with sows, you will see sows really almost obsessively using enrichment materials, toys and stuff that you put in there. And so this stereotypic behavior, I'm not sure it's always a sign that something's really wrong inside the sow's head. They just like using their mouths to do stuff, and they'll do it all day long if you let them. One point that hasn't been made yet this morning that I'll just draw out of this chart here is that with some of the ESFs, we have this really neat ability to deliver things other than feed to individual sows as they come to be fed. Now, of course, I'm talking about a system that reads a sow's RFID tag. And some of the ESF equipment can be set up to deliver oral medications, so wormers, Regimate if you're trying to hold some animals from coming into heat, and or antibiotics, you know, if the need should arise. And also biofeedback materials can be delivered through these little micro-dosing units. So that's pretty handy little added benefit of the ESF, which some of you have. Over here on the weaknesses, and we're going to talk more about this over the next few slides, I think it is true that you need more people in your dry sow barn with an ESF than you do with stalls. For sure in the transition period when you're trying to figure out how it works, that's true, but I think long term it's true as well. We'll talk more about that. There's no doubt there's more aggression between sows in a pen, and there's ways to manage that, but it is more than stalls, and we just have to we have to name that, and we have to work together to figure out how to minimize that. The transition is challenging. The space requirement is higher, therefore the cost is higher, at least to build the barn space to house the sows in. And then there's this question of increased complexity too, and I work with many farms where the manager, the owner of the farm, has mastered the computer that runs the ESF, and I can ask them any question about it and they can answer it. And so that's great, and then that person is never allowed to have a day off or is never allowed to get sick, right? Because if that happens, then we're just hoping and probably praying that the electronic feed system doesn't break down, because if it does, we're screwed. Not completely screwed. I understand that most of them are web-based, and you can bring in external support from somewhere else to help you out, but it's a factor. So I said we were going to look more broadly in the industry and look for some benchmarking information. This information is a little bit aged now. It's about 5 years old, but it comes from probably the biggest benchmarking and information service provider in the North American swine industry. It comes from SMS. Have you guys heard of SMS? You probably have. They're pretty well known. And they took a look through their data from, I believe this is 2011 data, and they compared the farms in their database that had crates versus pens versus ESFs. And at that time, of course, there was only a few early adopters using ESFs. And I mean, the bottom line is that they found fairly modest differences in productivity between these different types of farms. With the ESF farms, again, the early adopters, the people who are bound and determined to make this new technology work. But nonetheless, the people using ESFs were actually producing the most pigs by a fraction. And not huge differences in mortality, but this challenge on farrowing rate, which has been discussed a little bit this morning, starting to show up there. And I'm going to show you in our Ontario data, our current data, that is still the case. So that was from Ron Ketchum and his group, and it was presented in 2012. Presented more recently is some information from Thomas Livestock, and I bet some of you in this room have had a chance to visit Thomas Livestock out in Nebraska. Fantastic farm, big sow herds, and 2 of their sow herds have gestation crates. 1 has ESFs. And you can see here that just the same comparison in terms of litters per sow per year, so a measure of their ability to get sows pregnant in timely fashion and keep them pregnant. their wean pigs, so the fitness of their sows, their ability to have the right size of litter when the sow does farrow, and their lifetime performance, so a measure of the longevity of the sows. It is pretty similar between all three of these farms, with maybe a little flag here that the sows in the ESF aren't lasting quite as long. But with date over 1 year, that may reflect lots of other stuff in addition to just the method of housing, right? Sometimes, at least in this part of the world, we have to look at yearly data and say, oh yeah, but there was a PRRS break that year. So for producers who are sharing their information a little more broadly, it looks like ESFs are capable of producing pigs at about the same level as traditional stall barns. What about here in Ontario, though? I wanted to ask the question of the data which we collect, you know, is there a difference showing up on sow mortality? Is there differences in piglet production based on breeding success or based on the size of the litter that the sow has? And then other questions such as, well, what about the use of feed? Is it different, better, or worse in loose housing? And the way I'm going to answer these questions is by rolling through a series of cases. I think I've got 6 cases, which are either one or more farms where we've lumped the data together to try and learn something from it, okay? So the first case is a very good farm within a very good system, about 1,800 sows that has recently expanded. And when this farm expanded, they built 2 free access ESF pens. And these are gestall feeders, so they're the type, again, where the sow walks in, eats, and then backs out. So these are dynamic groups of 75 sows in each pen. Every other week, they add some sows to the group, and then they take the sows that are due to farrow back out. So in every week, showing up at the farrowing room, then they've got 15 sows that have just come out of an ESF, and it would be about 65 sows, 60 to 65 sows that have come out of stalls, and that's what we can compare. So in this ESF pen, they've got 19 sows per feeder, a little bit on the high side for recommendations. They've got 19 square feet per sow for floor space, just right at the borderline of how much space you want. And it's a nice, fully slatted barn, purpose-built, good flooring for feet and legs. And we just looked at some data that came out of Pignose, which is their data management program. So this is information from this year. As you can see, many more of the farrowings are by sows that had spent their gestation period in a stall. And let's just look at some of the outputs here. So the total born, slightly higher in the ESF. Stillborns, slightly lower in the ESF. That jives with what we heard this morning from Jennifer Brown. Liveborn, slightly higher. Piglet deaths, slightly lower. Is that a measure of fitness? I'm not sure it's significant. Again, this is not research. This is observation of the real world, but it's slightly lower. And a slight advantage to the ESF on pigs weaned. Now, one thing I want you to note here is the parity is not exactly the same. And of course, in this farm, every week they're selecting 15 sows to put into the ESF, and they're putting the rest of them in the stalls. So they're selecting fit sows to put into the ESF. That's a huge advantage that they have over a farm where every sow has to go into an ESF. So it looks from this little snippet of data from 2018 here that the ESF sows do have a slight advantage on productivity. But there is some bias in how those sows are chosen to go into loose housing. And it's not in the chart, but when you speak with this producer, there is some extra work there because there are 1 or 2 sows out of every group of 15 that end up getting pulled and put into a stall. Now, for the most part, they still farrow, but they get put into the group and then they get pulled back out. Lameness, body condition. So that's just one case. I got about...
Stall, that back out stall, that's what the jet stall kind of thing, right? That's not the self-feeding.
Yeah.
They're just getting feed up, getting into the stall and coming back out?
Yeah, or they may be sows that would have been lame all along in the stall too, but it didn't matter because they didn't have to walk anywhere until day of farrowing, right? Yeah. Any other questions about that? Yeah. Yeah, but this is new. It's 6 months or so, maybe 8 months now. So there is a transition period and a learning period here. I doubt that will be the number of pulls forever. These are mature sows for the most part that have lived their whole life in stalls and are going into a pen for the first time. Much different than when you have gilts that are trained in a pen before they ever get bred for the first time. Okay, moving on. I want to tell you about another case, and this is a system that has 5 sow barns in it. All the same genetics, all the same feed, all the same management. I didn't put the same health status on there because it is Ontario, and if you have 5 sow barns in Ontario, you're going to have one that's sick probably all the time. And so we don't have that controlled for. But we do have a nice long time period here that we're looking at, 6 years worth of data. So the one barn that is loose housing is a floor-fed barn, so it's a competitive feed system. It can be a little rough and ready in there, but it's a good barn built just like the Arkel swine station, if you've ever been in there, with a nice big section of solid floor where the feed is dropped, and the sows are in groups of 30 in there. So I just went back over the last 6 years of data from this farm, and I compared the productivity in that one loose house barn versus the other 4. Okay, so we'll look at that. So the barn that's loose housed is this nice, great big thick line here. And this chart from 2013 to yesterday for farrowing rate shows that loose housing barn is a little bit more challenged on farrowing rate. I mean, we're looking at a system that is very productive, obviously. You can see that. Our farrowing rates are high 80s, low 90s. This is a new farm, so there wasn't a major problem. Prior to this, there just wasn't pigs prior to that, right? So they're first, yeah. So you can see that. There's a challenge there on farrowing rate. Where does that come from? Those sows are put together in groups after they're preg checked, and so there is some pregnancy loss in this group, and we would associate that with sows maybe being underprivileged or socially inhibited or getting beat up or getting injured, and us not getting in there and responding quickly enough to maintain the pregnancy in every case, and that can happen. Here's a chart for total born, and you can see again for the system over time, their curves going in the right direction. And you can see again that although the loose house barn is not always the lowest performing herd for litter size, it's not the highest either. And again, I think we can imagine as these embryos are implanting and growing that if there's stress on the animal that in some cases causes her to no longer be pregnant at all anymore, sometimes it will also lead to a reduction in the litter size if individual embryos or conceptuses don't implant or aren't supported. The sow mortality story, I think, is very cloudy. You can see that sow mortality goes up and down, and our barn that is a loose housing barn is not higher than the other barns for sow mortality in this system. Why is that? I'm not exactly sure. We're going to look at some other sow mortality information in a minute, which will show a different story, but that is what it is in this case. And then translate that to good old pigs weaned per sow per year. And yeah, you can see that the group house barn, until recently, was not the best barn in the system, but then more recently here it has popped right up. Why is that? We don't know, other than I think it reaffirms the story or the tale that it's all about the people. And when you challenge people with information like this, it doesn't matter what system they're working with, they can do that, right? Whether it's loose housing or stalls. I'm just going to keep ripping right along. How are we doing for time? Are we half done yet? We're good?
A little more than that.
Okay, well, I'll just keep going then. Any questions about that case, though?
When are they weaned or age weaned?
Yeah, in this system, there's a little bit of variability, but the loose sow, all these farms would be about 19 and a half to 20 days for most of this time period. Yeah, good question. I should have put that on in the description because that makes a big difference. Okay, so this is an interesting case. This is a guy, a family that has 2 barns. For a long time, they've had a fully stalled barn, and it's very productive, very good farm. Recently, they took on a second barn, and it is a loose housing barn. And so this is a tale of some of the challenges that occurred with that expansion and some of the differences between the performance in those two barns. So the ESF started up last winter. The first animals were bred last September, and the first farrowings then were in January. And so what I've done is I've just grabbed information from the last quarter, so from August to October of this year. So the real headaches of the transition are behind us now. And I've only looked at young sows because, of course, the existing barn has all the older parities, and it's not fair to compare them to the new barn that doesn't have those older parities if we don't take them out. But there were significant challenges on the startup of this barn. And I don't know what's wrong with me. I just don't trust computers. And in this case, my lack of trust, I think, would have actually been valid because there was some problems with software updates and equipment not being updated. And so there was a time period in this barn where the manager and the staff were believing that sows were being fed and they were not, or they're not being fed the right amount of feed. And that is probably, for me, one of the biggest take-home messages with loose housing is that if you've got out-of-feed events, that is a critical emergency, because what you're doing is you're training that sow to not come and use the feed station ever again. So we got to be really careful about that. There was also a staffing challenge there where I think there was some staff who said they were coming and then they didn't come, then there was no staff, and that was some of you have probably been there, and that was a big problem. And then this is a barn that was laid out many years ago for loose housing. It's not laid out the way you would lay out a barn today, and that's not the producer's fault. It's just the nature of the barn, but it contributes to some of the what we're going to see in the next chart here. So the last 3 months, the ESF barn, which is the new barn, is on your left. The stalls are on your right. And you can see pretty big difference in farrowing right there, right? 6 points. Significant difference in live born, a whole pig. Big difference in sow mortality. Now let me stop there. I don't think that will be the tale forever. That's 3 months. I think this is an abnormally low sow mortality number, so they got lucky in the stall barn, and I hope that that is an abnormally high mortality number for that ESF. But I mean, we got to recognize that's not an abnormal number anymore for sow mortality. 10% and higher is common. And then that translates into, at this point, a pretty significant difference in pigs weaned per sow per year, 3 pigs, eh? And that's a real cautionary tale about starting up, especially a barn that maybe someone else set up, maybe a long time ago, that you know, when the advisors who are learning, you know, every week how to do stuff better than they did in the past, that's real. That's real.
Are those numbers reflective of what the previous owner was doing?
No, the previous owner, so I don't know for sure, Matt. I didn't work with the previous owner, but I am willing to guarantee that this number is significantly higher than what the previous owner was doing. And I want to, let you know that if we look at the pigs weaned per mated female per year, and I include November data, which is almost complete but not quite, it's way up. And so I have shown you, I think, just the tail end of the transition period where the producer was trying to figure this out. But you know, the farrowing did start at the beginning of the year, so it's a prolonged transition period. There's been some hard lessons learned there, but it's going better now.
What months did you say that this was for? August to October?
Yeah, the 3 months from August to October. And the first farrowings were back here in January. Okay, I've got another one of those. Just interesting the way last year went. The exact same type of situation. And this is a different farmer who also started up a second barn and also started breeding sows, gilts, last September. Now the difference here is that in this case, the producer already had a stall barn and he built a new ESF barn. Exact same feeders, technology, computers, software as the previous case, but a barn that was built, purpose-built in 2017, brand new. One other little difference here is that in this new barn, we are making our groups pre-implantation, which means we're breeding the sow, putting her into a group right away. And there's been some discussion about that through the morning here. I'm going to show you a slide on that, another case in a few moments, but that's the setup in this barn. And again, we just jumped into the data from August to October and compared the young sows to make it fair, okay? Tells a different story. Let's go through this. In this case, the ESF and the stall barn have the exact same farrowing rate. The live born in the ESF is actually significantly higher than the old stall barn. The mortality percent is a little higher. In fact, it's almost double higher, but it's still a pretty reasonable number of 6%. And the pigs weaned per mated female per year is, well, almost 30, which is quite an achievement in the first year of production with a young herd. So this is a case where the new ESF barn was built just the way the advisors wanted it built. It was stocked pretty close to the way the advisors wanted it stocked, meaning we trained the gilts on the one-way gates before we started breeding them, not the other way around. And it stayed relatively healthy, and this is the result.
Out of curiosity, are the two farms running the same genetics?
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yep, they are. Same genetics, same vet.
Like both this case and the last case?
Yeah, you can't blame the vet. Hein, do you want to come up here and say that? No. Sorry, I think you had a fault.
Just both cases, like the last case and this case, not just the two farms?
Yeah, no,
in this?
no. Case 3 and case 4 are actually the same genetics. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it can be done, and this is a great success story, not without its challenges. Some of that mortality is feet and legs, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? We haven't, up till now, focused on the fitness of the gilts, and some of the gilts weren't fit enough, and they couldn't stay in the herd.
So would you say that's the difference, this new barn or that converted barn, that is the difference in numbers, or is it management and staffing?
Both these managers are excellent managers. There is a difference in staffing because in the second case, in this one, his main staff were there and they were ready to work when the gilts were to be bred. In the previous case, he was really left short when a staffing problem arose. So I think staffing is part of it, but I think it is the barn layout as well. Yeah, the other barn, the previous barn is just not laid out to.
Yeah, because of the mortality double.
But again, I doubt that other farm will last on 11% mortality. I expect it'll go down.
Frank, sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Glenn.
Question with the stalls one. Are they breeding in stalls and leave them in the same spot, or are they moving them?
They're bred and moved. Yeah, okay. They're bred and moved. Oh, thanks. They're bred and moved. Yeah, yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Like at a day, you don't know what day they're
after preg check. At least in this last case, Glenn. So in this barn here, those animals are bred, preg checked, and then moved across the barn into the dry sow stalls. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So those are two new startups, and they were interesting, but I thought, what if then we look at a bunch of new startups, including some startups that are in stalls, and these would be barns that, you know, were empty. They're obviously not new barns anymore that are built with stalls, but they're barns that were empty that got refilled, or herds that were unhealthy and they underwent a depop and a repop, and compared them to loose housing barns that are also new startups. So we went back over the last 4 years and looked at 14 new herd startups that we as a vet practice were involved in. 5 of those were stall barns and 9 were ESFs, or free access ESFs. So I'll tell you that amongst this data, these 9 farms, it's mainly NEDAP or Gestall, okay? So a variety of genetics here and health status. It's just all over the map. You're going to see some of these people had PERS breaks in this data set that you're going to be able to pick right out. And they've been in production various lengths of times. The longest ones have been in production now 4 years. And I got to tell you a story about these graphs. Mandy is here amongst several of our gang from our info services department at Southwest. And Mandy helped me a lot with this presentation. I said, can you change the colors? Because I can't see colors very well. So make the stalls all one type of color and make the loose barns all another type of color. What I forgot to tell her was that I am red-green colorblind. and I can't tell the difference between the red and the green here. So I asked my daughter last night, is there different colors on here? And she rolled her eyes and was like, yeah, there is. So she assured me that you did a good job. Next time, I'll have to remember what colors I can see. Okay, so there's different lengths of lines on here, right? So this little short line, that farm has only been in production 2 quarters. These 2 farms here, they've been in production 16 quarters. And there's 14 lines there of various length. The reddish ones are stall barns, right? And the greenish ones are loose pen barns. And you can see that, generally speaking, the farrowing rate looks a little higher on the red ones than it does on the green ones. And some of the tougher farrowing rates are green ones. And when we take all that data and summarize it, this is the difference in farrowing rate on those 14 startups that have occurred over the last 5 years. There's a significant difference in farrowing rate there. Live born. Now, okay, so this is a PERS break, right? That's a stall barn that lasted 13 quarters until they got PERS. And you can see what happened to their live born. But even including that, because I didn't try and scrub this up to take all the PERS breaks and stuff out of it, the live born is essentially the same. Sow mortality. Okay, this green line here goes off the charts here. That was manure spreading or manure agitating. That has nothing to do with the type of housing. So I didn't bother to show you that. But again, I didn't clean the data up, but that is the difference between sow mortality and the loose house startups and the startups that use stalls. One more. The pigs weaned per mated sow per year. Again, PERS break here, right? But in the stall barns, the productivity is a little higher than in the loose barns. In these 14 farms that have started up over the last 5 years. So what can we say about that? My conclusion is just simply this. It's harder to start up a loose house barn than it is to start up a stall barn. And the people who have done it here might agree with that. They might disagree. When we do a comparison, that seems to me to be what comes out of the information that we have in front of us. However, there's another way to look at this again. We're on to case 6 or 7 now. I've lost track. But I asked the question then, okay, if we look at our bureau of all the farms that we manage the data for, and there's 200 or so of them, and we look at the top ones, are they stall barns or are they loose housing barns? So I, again, used this last quarter or 3-month period of August 1st to October 31st. And I just sought out the 10 herds that have the highest pigs weaned per female per year, okay? And so here they are. If we were to do this analysis in the other half of the year, these numbers would be higher, right? These are actually farms that manage the summer heat wave pretty well, and still are putting out close to 30 or over 30 pigs weaned per sow per year. And interesting, the number 1 herd in our practice is a herd that breeds a sow and puts her into a group right away. So it's that pre-implantation mixing, which to me feels a little riskier than waiting until the sow is preg checked and then putting her into group. But for this farm, it's sure working, isn't it, at 32.2 pigs weaned per sow per year. The second farm is a very well managed farm, not a fancy farm. It's been added on to over the years, and they have a real mix of dry sow housing. They have mostly shoulder stalls, groups of about 12 sows, and they put the sows into those pens after they're preg checked. They also have some freedom stalls, and they have, I didn't put it on here, but they do have a couple small pens for bred and pregnant gilts as well. But it's really working, almost 32 pigs weaned per sow per year. The third barn is an older barn, still 100% stalls. The fourth and the fifth barns and the seventh barn are all, Those are all actually the free access ESFs, okay? So they're the ones that the sow has to walk into and then has to back out of, but they're working very well. And then down here at number 10 is another one of these pre-implantation ESFs. So that's a feeder that, or a feeds group system that the pigs are put into right after breeding again. What do we conclude from this information? Well, as has been said this morning, it matters much more about the people and the overall management of the farm than it does the system, clearly, right? Because there's many different ways to, I'm not supposed to say skin a cat, I'm a vet, not supposed to be skinning cats, but that's what you could say about that. Okay, so I'm going to speak to this with one farm that I'm experienced with. How are we doing? 5 more minutes? A couple more minutes? I'm almost done. So this is a producer that built a nice new barn and set it up to do pre-implantation mixing. Okay, so we breed the sow, we throw her out of the stalls, put her into the big pen with the other sows. And this column represents the data that was generated from the farm up until February of this year when they said, we're not doing that anymore. And they actually installed 4 more rows of stalls so that they could hold on to the sows in stalls until they were preg checked. Now, there are other changes that would have been made in this before and after time period as well, but this is the difference that we see between the pre-implantation mixing and the post-implantation mixing. And I think it is real and significant. A 10% increase in farrowing rate after they made that renovation. The total born and born alive on this farm are obviously really high, but they're significantly higher now this year since we made that change. Oh, and I spelled parity a really weird way. Sorry about that. But I just wanted to demonstrate that the parity was the same before and after. It's not like something else happened with the herd parity to make this change. But yeah, the returns, way lower. Over 9 months to have, pretty near 60 fewer returns. That's really helpful to not have those open sows kicking around all over the place. So this has been successful. Unique to this herd, probably. Unique genotype at this herd. And as we've heard so many times, every farm is different and there probably isn't a one size fits all, but for this herd, post-implantation mixing is the way to go. Very quickly here, I want to go back to one of the cases where I was telling you about 5 farms, all part of the same system, and I want to just briefly address feed usage. In this farm, the feed usage in the loose barn is actually not quite as high as in a couple of the other barns, or it's similar. Now, you wouldn't expect that, right? You'd expect floor feeding would use more feed because you're giving away some feed to the manure pit that the sows don't eat, so you need more. And I think if we take out the differences here in how many open gilts they keep on these farms, that would be true. Generally speaking, though, these are numbers, to keep in mind. For floor feeding, the literature says 0.1 to 0.3 kilos more feed per sow per day. In ESF, it actually goes down, right? Because you're using your feed more efficiently. You're not wasting feed. What the sow gets and needs is right there in front of her. I won't spend too long on that, though, because I want to wrap this up and leave a minute for questions. My 4-point summary. Yeah, I believe this, and I think many of you do too. Loose housing, it can deliver the same or better results than stall housing. And for startups, you can be highly successful in loose housing, but that is really helped with purpose-built construction and breeding the gilts on site after training. That's really critical. I still say that starting up a loose housed herd is more difficult than starting up a stalled herd. And I think that these increases that we are seeing in this data and other people are seeing on sow mortality and more challenging time keeping sows pregnant to achieve the high farrowing rate we're used to, I think those are going to continue to be big challenges in loose housing. And we're all going to be working together, vets, feed people, producers, genetics companies, to continue to push that back down again. Recommendations, I think I've covered these, so we'll go quickly through this. I really think that the gilts must be trained on the ESF prior to breeding. So that really puts a challenge on our model of doing a repop where we find a nearby empty finishing barn and we breed all the gilts there. That can be really rough. And it needs to be considered, and we need to put the partial budgets to it to figure out what the best way to start up a herd is now if it's going to be a loose housed herd. I think it's really important that we work hard on optimizing, harmonizing body condition prior to forming groups. Because once they're in the group, whatever variability is in there is just going to get better, or worse, not better, from the moment you make the group till they farrow. I've talked about this a lot with farmers. I don't think it's enough to just look at that non-eater list out of your computer and say, okay, we've checked the herd for today. There are lots of sows out there that are going to eat, but they're not right. And if you don't go and observe the animals every day, you're going to miss some lame animals that it could be shockingly lame, but they're still getting to the feeder and eating. So you do need to go and get every sow up every day and check her. And some of the systems can tell you who eats when. And so if you got sows that eat all their feed, but they always eat last, those are sows you should go find and have a look at, because they're probably socially inhibited sows, if not sick or lame sows. And you need more staff in your dry sow barn. Last slide. I think, and I've said it already, that post-implantation grouping is safer than pre-implantation grouping. I'm not saying both can't work, but it's safer. I think that what was said this morning, I would echo. We don't want to cheat on our space or on our density on our ESFs. Do not exceed what the recommendation from the manufacturer is. I don't think it will pay. I think we've got to be very careful with our renovating and our retrofitting and using used equipment. That's where some of the more severe problems have occurred. And ask for as much input as possible. Visit as many barns as possible before you proceed. I don't have to say that to this group because you guys are the ones who've been doing it for a year or more already, right? Okay, I just want to thank all the producers who let me show some of their information here. And I hope there's a moment for a question or two yet.
Quick moment, and then we're going to skedaddle. For the majority of, Francis is going to start in about 2.5 minutes.
Oh.
So if you can ask some questions, maybe you can stay for a couple of minutes if there's some of the individual questions. But we will ask that everyone kind of mosey on up to the main room. So any questions for the group?
Have you looked at the cost differences between the systems on per pig out the door? Not that we're supposed to be concerned about that, because it's all about the humane treatment of these animals, but just curious.
Yeah. Haven't looked at that, but I mean, anything that reduces the output of weaned pigs is going to really increase the cost to produce a weaned pig, right? So that's where the answer is. It's if we don't have enough pigs to wean every week, the cost gets high.
Make 1 point for late fallouts.
1 point for late fallouts.
What would you recommend?
Really watch the body condition, and do not delay on pulling out the underprivileged, socially inhibited, or injured, lame, sick sow. I think a lot of those late fallouts are ones that we maybe would have had a chance to do something with if we were aggressive enough. I mean, that's really an oversimplification, but that's where I'd start.
In the sow mortality numbers between the groups, different housing systems, are there differences in why the sows are dying?
Yeah, there is. And I mean, one thing that is a surprise to me is when we go and modify the feed system to fit it into loose housing, how many times we end up with out-of-feed events. And it's just because, okay, these new feeders are a little different and our feed doesn't flow through them as we thought it would. Oh, surprise. So then we have sows that don't eat, then we have ulcers, then we have twisted guts and all that crap. So there's actually quite a bit of that in some of those mortality cases. And lameness would be a big one too. She's too lame, we have to pull it out and euthanize her.
I think at this point that's all the questions. Thanks so much, Greg.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.